Okay, so I have a topic here that's really important for anybody who's looking at electrification, looking at the social, movement and economic movement of getting more of our end users of energy, deriving their energy from electricity instead of burning fuel on site or at the point of use. This is a very large and complex topic, and there's an aspect of this that's important, critically important to understand when we are considering the idea of using renewable energy instead of fossil fuel energy. Um, and that is and also nuclear energy too. That is the equivalency of energy in terms of after it passes through electricity generation and you take into account the losses associated with electricity generation. You can see from these Sankey diagrams here that this electricity generation process is only reported to be about 35% efficient. I think that they're making some assumptions here. It might be higher than that. But basically, you're losing about 2/3 of the energy as rejected energy. And a lot of people misunderstand as to where that rejected energy is coming from. Rejected energy is effectively energy that's lost to the environment and doesn't get utilized for any kind of economic purpose. It's not being used for heating a building or running lights or powering something or doing any useful thing. It just ends up dissipating to the air. It's kind of like your car's radiator. That energy in your car's radiator, which is designated by this, just goes out into the atmosphere. It doesn't do any useful work. It's just a byproduct of the engine. And what you have to understand is whether it's the car engine or whether it's a steam turbine at a power plant, most of the energy ends up as rejected in a heat to mechanical power type process where we convert heat energy, thermal energy, into mechanical work. We lose most of the energy because of thermodynamic limitations associated with it. There's a lot of engineering trade-offs that cause it to be that number. Now, we have to realize that those losses do not exist in that magnitude when we consider renewable energy like solar, hydro, wind, because those energy sources do not require conversion from thermal to mechanical power. They do not go through that step, and that is the step where you lose most of the energy. And so if we're doing electricity generation, we lose some energy when we burn coal, for example. We lose some in the boiler that goes up the exhaust stack as heat. That might be 5 to 10% of the total of the energy that's lost through the stack of the power plant. Then the rest of the energy is in the boiler. We make steam. We send the steam to a steam turbine, and the steam expands through the turbine and turns the generator. And then it goes as a low pressure vapor, effectively expands into a vacuum of a condenser, and the condenser converts the gas, the steam, back into liquid water. And that energy that's condensed, that condensation heat, represents probably, say 30%, or actually no, 60% of the energy that's in the fuel is lost as heat that's condensed out of the steam. That's when the steam is condensed, converted back to liquid water. We send that heat to a cooling tower, or we send it back to a river or a lake, and we dispose of it. We just disperse it into the environment. So when you drive by the power plant, you see these huge billowing plumes of steam. That is the energy that's being rejected because of the losses of converting steam from a gas to a liquid. Okay, that energy cannot be captured by the turbine. And then we have energy that's lost running the power plant itself, driving all of the auxiliary systems, the pumps, the fans, and all the stuff that you need. All right, but that's maybe 5%, 5 to 8% of the energy. And then we lose some electricity as it goes through the power lines. It goes through the power transformers, it goes into the grid, it goes down the wires. You have losses in the transmission and distribution system, but they're also like 5 to 10% at the most. 10% being a very high number for probably a rural area. And we lose that, and by the time it's all said and done, we're getting about 35% of the energy. But the biggest, absolutely the biggest chunk of these losses is in the steam turbine at the power plant. Right? Now, people being, smart and able to figure this stuff out, they have found ways to reduce those losses. So when we burn natural gas, we're able to convert the natural gas into electricity using a two-stage process. We use a gas turbine, basically kind of think of like an aircraft jet engine. We send the natural gas in there, we burn it, we make hot air, we spin the turbine with the hot air, the hot compressed air, then we use that hot exhaust to make steam that then drives a steam turbine. So you put two cycles in series, you get 50 to 60% of the energy out in the form of electricity instead of only 35% out in the form of electricity when we have that we get with coal with just a single cycle. Right? Nuclear power is effectively comparable to coal. It's a single cycle process. You have one heat engine that converts heat from the fuel or from the nuclear reaction into electricity through a mechanical generator. Right? But look at solar and wind and hydropower. These are totally different. At least, especially solar, is very, very different. So hydropower and wind are effectively the same idea. It's just one uses water and one uses air as the working fluid. We put the fluid through a turbine, it turns the turbine, it takes kinetic energy out of the fluid, takes energy from the fluid and converts it to mechanical shaft work that turns the generator, makes electricity. That process is very efficient. Hydropower plants, wind turbines, those machines are 90-95% efficient at converting the rotating turbine into electricity. It's very, very high. Solar power. Solar is even more bizarre, right? You don't even have any moving parts. You just have a piece of glass. You've got this piece of glass. You put it outside in the sun, it generates electricity. There's no moving parts. There's no water. There's no fluids. There's no noise. There's no fire. There's no emissions, no smoke, no crazy noise, rotating machinery. This is what I think really gets people weirded out about solar energy, is because they view this as nothing's happening. There's nothing going on, right? How can that compare with this whirring coal-fired power plant that's burning 20,000 tons of fuel a day? Well, that's just the reality of photovoltaics. You don't have any moving parts. You don't have any of that stuff, and that's what makes it so good. All right. So, how do we compare something like solar, wind, and hydropower that doesn't have those thermal losses, those thermodynamic losses, to the energy sources that do have the losses? Well, if we're looking at coal, we basically just do it like, 35% is about a factor of 3, right? So if we are generating electricity and 3.3% of our national energy consumption is coming from wind, if we shut those wind turbines off and instead built coal-fired power plants, how much coal would we have to burn? Well, we'd multiply that by 3. We'd end up with about 9 quadrillion BTU. So this line going into electricity generation that represents the purple here for wind would inflate by a factor of 3. It would just about match this coal number here. Well, that number there, it would be close to that. We would have to use much more energy in the form of coal than what we're using from wind, because coal has engineering losses associated with it that wind doesn't have. Same thing with solar. If we were going to use natural gas to replace the energy we're getting from solar, we would have to use double. So instead of 1.5 quadrillion BTU, we'd have to use 3 quadrillion BTU, because natural gas combined cycle power plants are only about 50 to 60% efficient at converting heat into electricity, or converting fuel into electricity. So these values have to adjust accordingly with the thermodynamic losses that the energy source has. So how about nuclear power? They're showing us 8.13 quadrillion BTU going in from nuclear power. If we were to replace nuclear power with wind or solar, we would only need about 2 or 3 quadrillion BTU. So it really shows the difference there in terms of the losses of the combustion and thermal energy sources versus the non-combustion, non-thermal energy sources. A lot of the statistics try to account for that. When you read the EIA data and like BP statistical reviews, sometimes they will say they use what they call the substitution method, where they try to basically make these things look as if they are, equivalent with each other when they're trying to compare them with each other, because of the losses that you incur when you burn fuel and try to convert it into mechanical work. This really comes into play when we look at electric cars. So some people, and it usually comes from people who are skeptical of electric cars, they will take the amount of energy going into light-duty cars, light-duty vehicles, and they will convert that into electricity and say that we need to increase our production of electricity by that amount. And that is not an appropriate way to do it. Because here we're showing, and this is a little bit older data, but it still is a good number, that 16.6 quadrillion BTUs, actually 17 quadrillion BTUs of energy is going into light-duty vehicles. Do we need 17 quadrillion BTUs of electricity to power those same light-duty vehicles? No. All right. The better comparison is to look at the useful energy flow from the light-duty vehicles, which they're indicating as 3.4 quadrillion BTUs. It's a factor of about 4 to 5, which accounts for the fact that a car engine is only 20 to 25% efficient at converting fuel into mechanical work at the wheels of the car. I would say the better number would be that we need 4 quadrillion BTUs to run the light-duty vehicles, and as a result, we might have to increase our national electricity consumption by 25 to 30%. Right now, we're using about 12.4, well, something like that. That's 12.9 now. We might have to add 4 to 12.9, okay? We could easily just add enough solar, wind, and natural gas and get us there with very little problems. So the whole idea that our grid is woefully unequipped and never will be equipped to handle electric vehicles is a legend and a myth and a fairy tale that seems to, just support the idea that electric cars are no good because somebody doesn't like them for whatever reason. But when you take into account the losses of the traditional internal combustion engine, it's a significant, change, going from gasoline going into a car and you're only getting, 20% of it out as useful energy, whereas with electricity, you're getting 80 to 90% of it out as useful energy. It's 4 to 5 times more efficient. So that's kind of the important distinction to make when we compare energy sources, especially ones that are burning stuff versus ones that are not burning stuff. Because ones that are not burning stuff have much lower losses in the entire process of converting from one form to another. These over here is what we call primary energy. Primary energy traditionally was used to make a distinction against electricity and against things like gasoline, which are manufactured products. But wind energy is converted, wind energy as a primary energy source is converted into electricity at like 95% efficiency. You can't look at the wind or the sun and say that a solar panel, a solar panel converts 20% of the energy that falls on it into electricity. You can't look at that as a downside the same way that you could look at coal as being 35% efficient, because that coal would not have been burned if we weren't trying to get electricity from it. Whereas the sunlight would have been there regardless of the presence of the solar panel. So the energy can't be viewed as waste from a solar panel the same way that it's viewed as waste from a coal-fired power plant with a steam turbine and rejected over here. So we can't count that as being rejected energy with solar or as wind or as hydro or with hydro like we can with coal. Geothermal is sort of an in-between case because the energy is there regardless, but it was extracted from the ground at a much higher rate than it otherwise would have been. So you could toss a dice and say whether you want to consider the losses of geothermal, but it doesn't really matter. But with solar, wind, hydropower, it's very important. So that's the story. It's very important to make sure that we consider the equivalencies of power generation fuel sources when we make comparisons, because a unit of coal or a unit of wind energy is not the same. A unit of wind energy is effectively 3 units of coal when we convert it to electricity. So that's it. That's the story with that.